Before we take an up-close look at making the buttonholes on our little swatch, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about fun with markers. So the pattern tells you for each size how many buttonholes you have and where they start and where they're spaced. So for my size, it says 7 buttonholes will be made. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it says the first one is located in the second purl 2 together section. So there's my first purl 2 together. There's my second purl 2 together. So I put a locking stitch marker. Then it says, then every third purl 2 together section afterwards. So I just go 1, 2, 3, put in a marker. 1, 2, 3, put in a marker. 1, 2, 3, put in a marker. So I like to do that because that way I don't have to be glued to the pattern where it says knit 2, purl 2, do that twice, knit 2, purl 2, okay, then knit 2, buttonhole. I know that when I see a marker, oh, slow down, that's where the buttonhole is going to be, and the buttonhole is defined as bind off 2, and then on the wrong side row you're going to cast on 2. But I have a nicer way to do it than the standard way. So we're going to take a look at that close up. Also, by the way, look at that. Look how nice our little pickup trick allows that rib to round that corner without any kind of weird puckering. Kind of fun. Okay, let's take a closer look at our buttonholes. The regular buttonholes as written in the pattern versus Patty's unvented buttonholes. And you can totally do either. And I'm just going to show you the first two as written, and then I'm going to show you with my trick, and you can decide if you want to do that. So I've placed my markers on my little sample swatch here where I'm going to put my buttonholes. So the first couple I will do regular. So it's a 2-row buttonhole. So the idea is I'm binding off 2, and then on the next row, I'm casting on 2. So that's the idea of the buttonhole as written. So here would be the 2 purl stitches that I'm going to get rid of. So that would involve me knitting 2, passing over, I've bound off 1, knitting 1, passing over, I've bound off 2. So you can see where that gap comes from, that of course these 2 columns of stitches are unconnected, and you can see that there's now a little, what looks like a purl bump wrapping around the throat of that knit stitch. So let's look at that again. So here is another buttonhole. So if I do it kind of the regular way, I'm going to bind off 1, bind off 2. So let me go a little further. I'm actually going to combination knit those purls just because that's what I usually do in my rib. It improves the look of the rib. And I have that video on combination knitting you can take a look at. So I'm just going to pull this down to the cable and we'll take a look. And you can see what you get is the gap, the dip, and then of course that little bump that interrupts it. So we want to correct those 3 things, the gap, the dip, and the little bump like I showed in my samples. So let's take a look at how we do that. So in the pattern, it's going to tell me to do my knit 2, purl 2, repeat as many times as I need to, and then it's going to end with a knit 2 right before the buttonhole. So the first thing you want to remember is you're going to stop on the single knit before your buttonhole. And to get rid of that gap, I want to connect this column of stitch with this column of stitch. So I'm going to do an increase. And because I'm going into a purl, I'm going to do a knit front back loop. Knit front back loop. Sometimes I do a left lifted increase with this. It depends on what stitch follows it, but I'm going to do a knit front back loop. Now I've added a stitch, I have to get rid of it. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these markers now. The ones for the buttonholes I've already done. So the first thing you need to do is you're going to work to the knit stitch before your 2 purls, and you're going to do a knit front and back loop. So you'll see what it looks like is a knit stitch followed by a purl. Okay, now I added a stitch, I have to get rid of it. So that means I'm going to purl 1 stitch, and I'm going to pass that added stitch that I just made over. And now I've gotten rid of it. So now I still have to begin my bind off. So that was just adding a stitch, getting rid of a stitch. So now I get rid of 1 purl stitch, but now I'm going to pause. Now I need to get rid of the next little boo-boo, which is that purl bump that wraps around the throat of that knit stitch, because what it is of course, it's a stitch lying on its side, right? When I do the passover, it's lying on its side. So instead, I'm going to get rid of that last stitch by doing a knit 2 together. So I'm going to pass that stitch that I just worked over to the left-hand needle, and I am going to knit those 2 together. Let's take a look at that one more time, and then we'll pull this down to the cable and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to work my way to my next buttonhole, and we'll see what that looks like. So as always, I'm going to pause when I get to that 1 knit stitch before the buttonhole. And there I am. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to tip this camera up a little bit. So I can hold my hands a little more naturally. There we go. Okay. So there I am, 1 knit stitch before the purl. And I'm going to do a knit front back loop. Now remember, I've added a stitch. I have to now get rid of it. So the purpose of that is to lock this column of stitch together with this. So now I purl 1 and I get rid of the stitch that I just made, and I begin my bind off. Purl 1, pass over. Remember, we're only binding off 2. So now, instead of binding off my second stitch, I'm going to pass that stitch on the right-hand needle back to the left-hand needle, and instead I'm going to do a knit 2 together. All right, so let's take a look at the comparison, and we still have another trick, which is the cast on over. But I'm just going to pause for a second, and we'll pull this down. Okay, so there you have the traditional buttonhole, and you can see that gap, you can see the dip, and the dip happens from the bind off, and you can see that little bump, right? Now the other thing about that bump is that bind off is going to pull at this stitch a little bit. So when you knit over it, you often get that tiny hole that I showed in the samples. But instead, there's Patty's unvented buttonhole. So we have no gap, no dip, and we have uninterrupted column of stitches over here, uninterrupted column of stitches over here. So there's your traditional as written button, and there's Patty's trick. So I didn't write this into the pattern because it is like an extra credit trick, but I think it makes quite a lovely buttonhole. So I'm going to finish up this row, and then I'll meet you on the wrong side row, because the next trick we need to look at is for the cast on over the gap. I'm back on my wrong side row, and it's time to look at the cast on over the buttonhole. So I've got my 2 patties unvented and my 2 standard. So I'm going to show you both. And by the way, look at how pronounced the dip is from the bind off when you don't lock the 2 columns of stitches together versus when you do. So remember, we bound off 2 stitches. So in a traditional 2-row buttonhole, I would now cast 2 stitches on. Now I've tried every cast on known to man. I've tried cable cast on, knitted cast on. And in Patty's trick, you are going to be very surprised to find out that I'm going to use an E-loop cast on. So I'm going to take that yarn and I'm just going to make a loop and put that on my needle. But now remember, I bound off 2. So in Patty's trick, I'm only going to cast on 1. And you're going to see why later in the next row. So let's take a look at that again. So here I go to the next buttonhole. And I'm doing my thing, which is on the wrong side row. I purl Western. I only do that lazy purl on the public side row, which of course leaves my knit stitches mounted with the leading leg in the back, like in the combination video, and I work that through the back loop. So here we go, one more time. Let's do another E-loop cast on. So I just make that loop. Now the one thing, sometimes I'll see knitters, they make a loop and then they put it on this way, and of course it just comes apart. But remember, it's like pretend you're tying a knot and the needle is the other end of the knot. So where that loop is crossed, right, there's that yarn crossed in front, that is the side of the loop that goes onto the needle. If I cross that yarn in front and I enter like this, I don't have a loop, right? So I need to basically tie a knot with the needle. So I'm making a loop and I'm putting it on the needle. So remember, in Patty's unvented needle, unvented button, I've bound off 2 stitches, but I'm only going to cast on 1. So we'll take a look at the regular buttonholes. And then it takes row 3 before we really see the magic. So here I am to my regular buttonhole, and I will E-loop 2 stitches. 1, 2, because remember I bound off 2, so I'm casting on 2. And here comes the third fix that we're going to do, which is trying to get rid of that other gap, the gap on the top of the buttonhole. So let's look at that one more time, and then we will look at the third row that finishes this up, because the next thing in your pattern before the shawl collar is work 2 rows straight. So you're going to work another right side row and another wrong side row. Okay, so let's turn that around, and we will first take a look at our regular buttonholes. Remember, we have 2 regular buttonholes, and then we'll have 2 Patty's unvented buttonholes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to work in pattern, but what you're going to see is when I get to those E-loop stitches, there's those 2 E-loop. Now the one thing I always do is work any cast on in pattern. So I am going to purl those guys. But an E-loop will often leave a bit of a gap, which we're going to look at in a second. So let's take one more look at our traditional, not doing any tricks, just regular buttonhole as written, which is simply binding off 2, and then in the next row, casting 2 on. So here we go. I am going to purl these, because I am going to work in pattern. And we'll work a couple stitches and just pull that down to the needle and take a look to see how that looks. Okay. It's going to be even easier to see after the next row. So you have, you know, all the things that I don't love. So it's not terrible, and you know, you don't have to do the trick. If you're just like, oh, you know what, I'm always going to leave my cardigan buttoned, so it's fine. But I just want you to know the choices. So you have that little gap there, you have that little purl bump there, and you have a little bit of a gap over here. I'm going to actually finish the other row, and then you'll really be able to see it. So now the unvented. So the thing with the E-loop is it does have a similar elasticity, and it'll give you a good looking edge. But the problem with an E-loop is it's just one loop around the needle. And even though you saw me get pretty close as I knit the next stitch, remember I only did one E-loop wrap, and I'm going to show you why. We're going to turn lemons into lemonade. So there's that knit stitch, and now here I am to my buttonhole. And drink! Look at all that slack from the E-loop. So that's going to be your second stitch. So you want to just take that and twist it, and you can use your fingers, you can use a crochet hook. I use a knitting needle, kind of like I'm doing a make one. And the only thing I just want to be sure of is that it's wrapping in the same direction, which it is. And now I will go ahead and purl that. Let's take a look at that one more time. So here I'm going again to Patty's unvented buttonhole, where I will only have one E-loop, not two. So don't forget this part. Don't just purl that guy, because then all of a sudden your stitch count's going to be wrong. Woo! Go ahead and let that gap develop, because with that extra yarn, you're going to create your extra stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this row, and then I'm going to work my wrong side row, and we'll take a look at the finished product. So there you go. Here's the regular buttonhole, and you can see the little gaps, and of course that bump and the little bit of a hole that comes from the pull there, versus the unvented buttonhole, which has two completely uninterrupted columns of knit stitches and a very neat little buttonhole. So if you're like me and you're constantly unbuttoning your cardigan, you might want to try the buttonhole trick. Okay, next up we will look at our shawl collar.